you can hear me. All right, well, welcome to this Saturday morning workshop on editing. I'm really delighted to see you here. If you need to move closer, feel free to move a bit closer. And we have the slides that will come up here on a board. So the one thing that occurs to people who write for a very long time is this realization that most writing happens in rewriting. So if you come to think of it for a minute, that we receive this gift of a poem. We receive this inspiration, whether that is a little bit of emotion rumbling, inside of you, whether that's a particular image that brings up something in your head, whether that's a memory popping out of nowhere, or something very intentional. You're saying, I want to write about this particular experience. However that comes, you perceive it as a gift. And it's a gift of language, because all of it is interacting with the language that you speak, but it's also the language that you feel, which tends to be a bit different, that language of feeling. You open yourself up to more expressive words, to more expressive sounds. So that's the one stage of writing. And many people say, all right, like Allen Ginsberg used to say, first thought, best thought. It's done. I don't want to sort of pollute or destroy the innocence, or the intensity, or the pleasure of the poem, because, the editing is just going to make it very cerebral. So this lecture here is to say, okay, while there is a lot of merit in maintaining the integrity of the poem, and the effort is to maintain that integrity of the poem, to make sure that the poem doesn't lose the freshness that we start with, right? That passion that we start with. Here, we need to focus on how we do that. So the act of editing is not what most of us think, something boring, something that you have to do for the editors, something that you have to do it only in a service of communication, and it's endlessly chopping at stuff and killing your babies, as they say, killing your darlings, as they say. It's not really that, but it's a way of protecting that integrity and in shaping that poem to fully make the translation between what you feel and what is on a page. That is what your reader will encounter, right? This is what your reader wants to encounter, something fresh. So the second part of the process really is most of the writing that you're going to do. So you're gifted the poem, in whatever way. When you sit down to work on the poem, you notice that you have to go through many different stages to articulate that's what the poem wants to be, right? So you have to sort of get to the intention of the poem and articulate it. So I'm working on a series of lectures. This is part of that. This is called From Inspiration to Publication. This one is about the editing itself. As I was saying just before, editing, really to put it in one sentence, is a search for self-articulation. So if writing is that immediate expression, that effusive expression onto the page in language, editing helps you articulate that. So that's how do I really find those perfect words? Everybody talks about the perfect words at the perfect time, and kind of trying to get to the reader. Vladimir Nabokov, in Speak Memory, in his memoir, said, I have rewritten often several times every word I have ever published. my pencils outlast their erasers. So, I mean, take courage from that. It's not so much about doubting yourself. It's not so much about, testing the limits of language, but really is about searching for that self-articulation. And interestingly enough, what happens is that our thoughts become clearer, our hearts become clearer, our emotions become clearer because we're able to use the language as a way of looking back at ourselves and looking back at our experience. So it's interesting how, you start with an emotion, you start with an experience, something that, you've encountered, someone that you encountered, an event that you saw on the news. You start with that, it seems all messy, you transform it into poetry. Now that seems like something that is orderly. But in the process of editing, you realize, ooh, I'm repositioning myself towards that event that I began with. So it makes this beautiful loop, this act of creativity. So I have many people in the classes who come in like, oh my God, I came to your class really having strong negative feelings about something or other, but now I feel differently. And the answer is right there, is because you use the language as a medium for reflection. You reflected by your choice of words on that experience, and that sort of cleared out your experience. So it's really a search for self-articulation. All right, so what does editing, what's that editing thing about? Reading like an editor involves asking questions and making decisions. So if you want to edit your own work, if you want to edit the work of others, if you're in a teaching profession, the skill you need to master is the reading like an editor. To read like an editor, you need to ask specific questions and you need to make specific decisions. So here we get to some of the questions. What is the strongest aspect of the poem, the sequence, or collection that makes it imaginative, memorable, or surprising? So here we go, as readers of poetry, as writers of poetry, we want to receive or we want to give imagination, something that feels imaginative, something that feels memorable, something that, you like poetry that you can remember. You go on with the line of the poem that keeps rumbling in your head long after you read the poem, and you go like, I really like that line. It makes me think. Or surprises you. So we are after, these are the guidelines. We're going for the imaginative, for the memorable, for the surprising. So you go back to your poem or your collection and say, what is there that meets this criteria? The second question is, what are the weakest or most repetitive parts that can be taken out? Now, there is a very big difference between anaphora, which is or a refrain. These are very intentional repetitions. It's things that we devise to create an emotional tone, to create an intellectual moment for the reader. We repeat things. Think about ballads. Think about formal poetry. Think about any of the formal poems, the triolet, for example, where you repeat the lines. These things are different from simple repetitive stuff that becomes very boring and takes away from the poem, or rather takes the reader out of the poem, and you think, I've heard that several times. It doesn't mean anything different the second time. So that's not really a villanelle here. It's just more like, da-dum, da-dum, I'm going to do something and repeat the same lines. What can be rephrased or reorganized for coherence and consistency? And this is an important thing to ask about the poetry. Just because poetry is expressive, is emotional, and is spontaneous, it doesn't mean that it has to be incoherent and inconsistent, We can't just sort of say, all right, I'm just expressing all of these and the reader will make sense of it. So now, everything that I'm saying here comes from my own experience. You might find a different poet standing in the same place and say something slightly different about their creative process. My feelings are quite strong. The poem needs to have coherence. We need to understand it. We need to perceive it even emotionally, if not logically. Something needs to happen there that we fully take in and absorb that language. And consistency. You know, we start with one thing, we end with that thing. We don't mix metaphors and move around. There are several kinds of edits, and I want to talk about a couple of those, the sort of the stages of the edits, and give you some time to work on your poems. Do you all have poems that you brought with you? Your own work? Brilliant. Okay, great. So the question here that I am asking you, and I asked of my own poems, is how can structure offer a stronger perspective on the poem, selection or collection? So it's choosing, you have to make the choice between thematic and chronological structure. Sometimes you can blend them. Sometimes you can say, I'm going chronologically over a series of events. For example, I wrote a book about the pandemic. It's called Time Being. The theme was an exploration of the sense of time, how it both contracted and expanded in those terrible moments that we experienced collectively and that I experienced as an individual. But it was chronological. It was from the beginning of the pandemic up until we were allowed to go outside, right? Until, okay. So you could blend them, but you have to be very careful on how you do that so there's consistency there. So here are some of the things that can make a difference. One is getting the title to do more work. Many of us treat the title as an afterthought. It's like, let me get the poem over there, and then, what title shall I put it? Okay, nope, title done. Well, you start from a title, but then the poem takes its own life. It goes in its own way. And then the title no longer does the job to point the reader to the essence of the poem. So it's important in the act of editing during this process to go back and say, does my title really say the same thing that I intended it to say at the beginning? Has it made that connection between sort of the inner life of the poem and its outer life, which is the announcement? The title announces the poem to the reader. Breaking the poem or the sequence or the collection into smaller parts to highlight shifts in tone, imagery, music, or meaning. I teach 10-week poetry workshops. So every 10 weeks, I have a new group of poets come through. And this is a consistent theme that occurs in my poetry workshop, talking about how we break the poem into smaller stanzas or into sections to let the images breathe out, to let the thoughts develop in the mind of the reader, to let the emotions sort of cohere in there. It's very fascinating to see what the white space on a page does. So you have your 3-line stanza, and you have 2 spaces, right? After these. Suddenly you are in a scene, you are in a state of mind, and then you can breathe out, and you're ready for the next thing. So think also of musical pieces, right? If you think of a symphony that has movements to it, you need that little breathing space between. So this is something to pay attention to, whether you want the poem to go straight through, like an octave, 8 lines going from beginning to the end, and woof, it just delivers what you wanted to deliver. You know, frost, nature's great, nature's gold is green, what is it? Great green is gold. That whole meditation on the greenness of nature and how it is the gold of life goes over the 8 line. Or if you want to break it into smaller pieces. The other thing you could do with the structural edit, and this makes a lot of difference for people, is changing stanza order. I don't know how many workshops you've been to where somebody asks you, can you put the last stanza first and see what happens? Can you put the first stanza in the middle and start the poem later when you actually are getting to the story, or are getting to what you're trying to say, and just kind of then you back up a little bit and to see? It's interesting because a lot of the times we structure the poems in our heads almost as mini essays. I'm going to talk about this, and so here are my thoughts lined up in order, right? So those of us, we might need a bit of disruption. How do you start that in a more spontaneous way, and does it still make sense? Is it still coherent? How can you surprise yourself by changing the stanza order? Moving lines around, same thing. Is some of the things that can happen can be quite magical by just moving your last line to the first line. So it all has to make sense for you, but it pays to play around. And then thinking about the physical shape of the poems on the page. Does your poem look, you know, if you like concrete poetry, does your poem look, if you're writing a poem about the vase or about a tree, does it look like a tree or like a vase on a page? If you're writing a sonnet, does it have that beautiful sort of, 14 line and all the lines about the same size? And does it, is it orderly? Is it beautiful? There is a sense of aesthetic that comes just by looking at the poem on a page. Again, that's something that doesn't happen when we first sit down to write the poem. We're so intense about an intent on articulating what we want to articulate. So, and then we're careful about choosing our words first to make sure that, whatever happens inside of us comes out onto the page. But then the physical shape has an extra sense of delivery. The poem is made of 3 things. One is the sound. What can you get from the sounds of the words themselves? From the meter, the rhyme, the onomatopoeia, the assonance, the consonants, these are sort of the sound effects, right? What do you get from that? And then you have the meaning that usually comes from these, pictures, the imagery, this pictorial part of the poem comes through the images that you're able to paint with words in a reader's mind, and they start to think about what they see. So what you hear, what you see, and then there's this sort of, that's the meaning from the words themselves, right? When you go like, I feel like I discovered a new word, or this word in this poem really makes a lot of sense. And it's, it delivers something very special. And then there is what am I holding in my hand? There are very few book publishers right now who produce these beautiful editions that you just love to just kind of put your hands over the pages and feel the texture of the page and just look at the poems as if they are art forms right on a page. That's something you can think about in a process of editing. So now you're starting to see how editing takes a lot longer than we're thinking, I wrote the poetry collection, I'm just going to sit down now and just read it over, make sure that the grammar is fine, all the commas are in the right place, done, right? Nothing like this. So I'm going to invite you now to take about 10 minutes, and based on the slide that you have here, try to look at your poem and sort of think a little bit about the title, think about the stanza structure, think a little bit about the sound, and see if you can tinker with it just a little bit to see where it takes you. Then we're going to move to the next slide, and we'll take another break, and we'll do that again, and then I'll take questions at the very, very end of the workshop. So 10 minutes? All right. You found yourself making some changes?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. We'll talk a little bit about this whole process at the end. I want to move on to the next slide. So if you are working with traditional forms, the question to ask is how correct or effective is the form? So is your sonnet missing the turn at the end? Is it missing the volta if it's a Petrarchan sonnet? Is it missing the last, the turn at the end if it's a Shakespearean sonnet? Are you pushing the language to fit into the shape or sound container and sacrificing common sense or all sense? This is a really big question. Many of us try to work with traditional forms and get quite intimidated by them. That's because there is a big history on our shoulder, right? On our shoulders, and we're thinking, I don't know if I am able to pull all of that. So then we start with, all right, 10 syllables per line, 14 lines, for example. Let's see what the argument is. But pretty soon we find that we're trying to fit what we're trying to say into those 10 lines, and we're trying to kind of hit the rhyme, and we're trying to hit the pattern of the iambic pentameter. And so pretty soon the language comes stilted. You know that word, right? It comes forced, it comes stilted. The rhythm is out of whack. So the question you need to, so how can you improve this? You just have to write hundreds of them, thousands of them. You just have to take each form and keep writing and hammering on that form as much as you can. The one exercise that I have for this is people can use a poem that they wrote in free verse or as a prose poem, and they can turn that poem into a sonnet, into a triolet, into a villanelle, into a sestina, so they can play same poem, same language, move it over, and then add, subtract language, evolve, write more, cut out some of, to play, to see how it is that, because a lot of times people will be like, okay, sonnets, okay. They have to be love poems or they have to be nature poems. I don't know what else to write. Okay, they can be about anything, but so once you take a poem that you wrote in your own style, whatever feels more comfortable to you, take it and write it as a sonnet. And then, try to do the same form, like I said, many, many, many times. Eventually, you develop a sort of rhythm that you can hear it by yourself. So the more you can hear the rhythm, the same way that you hear the patterns of a song, that you can sort of, the lyrics and the music, they sort of come together, you will get the same ease with the formal poems. Work with the essential patterns of each form. If something looks like a mistake rather than an intentional change of the form, then it will be perceived as a mistake or a lack of experience. So that's something that is, I cannot sort of overstate that. Let's say you are working again on well, the ballads are very easy to improvise upon, so then there are many variations, I say, to the ballads, but let's go back to the sonnet. If something looks like a mistake, if you're changing the iambic pentameter, if you're moving by the third line to only 4 beats or 3 beats, then you know that your lines are not adding up to keep up the rhythm of. It's even if you think you made it because it's more natural for you, people who are asked to believe that this is a sonnet would say, okay, this is a defective poem. So so this is very hard with people who don't really want to change their work. They feel like, okay, this is what I want to say, this is how I want to say it, and I'm calling it a sonnet anyway. Okay. but then you might have somebody giving you a little bit of a hard time because you're saying that you're working on a traditional form which doesn't quite match. So that's something to call your attention to. The line edit. This is something that, is really important. Is your poem, here's your question, is your poem sequence or collection a harmonious expression that combines music, meaning, and shape, the three things that I mentioned earlier? Is it something, as we all know, the poem needs to deliver on all fronts equally. So it just comes as a complete expression. Something that you can, just as you look at a painting, you take it all. You don't take it just for the shape or just for the color. You take it for everything, right? You absorb it for everything. Or a piece of music, it speaks to you at all the different levels. So how is it that you achieve this? How is it that you work? And what are some of the choices that you make to work with this? Well, you'll have to check for mixed metaphors. This always happens. Even the best writers take you on a track with one analogy. Metaphors, you make an analogy between things, and you're trying to express something abstract via making an association with something that is very concrete, right? So the rose stands for love, right? So the thing is, people can start with one analogy, and then at some point, the thought skips ahead, and it moves onto a different analogy. So you're mixing metaphors. So we thought we were following one track, and we're going on a different one. And so this also comes off as a mistake. And this is the role of the editor, is to make sure that mixed metaphors don't occur. Polishing sound and imagery patterns. There is that cohesion that comes from, again, developing an image and giving it that power over the lines, returning to that image, returning to that sound, so you don't want to start with a poem that is sort of, heavily alliterative in a first half and nothing happens in a second half. This also happens because we're more focused on what we're trying to say, right? So the editing is saying, do I have a sort of a sound that is, going throughout the poem, and it delivers through all the lines. And here comes the whole thing about avoiding repetition of ideas, of the words, and of phrases. There are essential patterns in poetry. And they're absolutely beautiful to work with. Everything that is harmonious follows a pattern. So you can go all the way from, how do the flowers, become so beautiful? How are they so beautiful? Well, they have the petals that are in a specific pattern. You're thinking about, the Fibonacci sequence, all the things in nature that come as a pattern. And you notice the tiny variation in a pattern that makes something quite beautiful and interesting and exciting. So you want to go that far, but not that much farther. When you work with the patterns. You don't want 3 big petals from the flower to fall apart because it looks like a broken flower. It no longer looks like something slightly off that gets you interested in it. It's not that switch at the beginning of the line from an iamb to a trochee that makes the heart go, ooh, that's something different. The ear goes, and the heart goes, ooh, I like that. Right? So it's okay to do that. It's okay to be very intentional about that. But if you're suddenly clanking along, then that's not doing the job for you. And work on your line endings. I'm noticing, again, this is through the teaching experience, but I also notice on my own poetry. So I've published 6 collections of poems by now. I published critical work as a scholar. I've been working on also essays on writing. And specifically, I'm working with the language of oppression in poetry. So all of this work sort of comes together as a critic, as a scholar, reading, and as a writer. It all comes together. And the line endings are part of that. Because it's interesting what the line ending can do for you. Is a line an expression? How do you conceive of a line of a poem? That's a very interesting question to ask yourself. Is a line a full thought? Is the line part of a continuing sentence? And am I using traditional punctuation? How am I capitalizing the beginning of each line? Do I use lower capitals when I continue the sentence and have that enjambment? Or do I capitalize every word at the beginning of each line? So to make it more formal, how am I using, we'll talk about punctuation in a minute here, but where the line ends can make a huge difference. If you end the line in an article, if you end the line in a connecting word, any kind of connecting word, so, I'm ending a line in a, or to, or but, right? Or and, or from. There is something about sort of leaving the reader dangling over that, or suddenly making only half a step up that stair. So you're putting the poem off balance, and you're putting the reader off balance. So, and this is very, very personal. There are people who say, I'm not going to use any punctuation whatsoever, and I'm going to have very short lines. But I was working with a poet just last week, in fact. She was changing the phrase altogether. So she had 3 words on one line, and the whole phrase was just beautiful. And then when she broke the line, the words didn't mean the same thing. The meaning didn't mean the same thing. She just broke the phrase down. And so it's important to sort of conceive of your lines. Are they units of thought? Okay, that's good. You can begin and end the line with the full thought. Are they part of the sentence? What about the unit of sound? Is there something missing? Even if you're not writing in metrical form, but is there something missing at the end of the line? Where are you adding something that is just clanking at the end of the line? So line endings can mean quite a bit. So you notice them more as a critic because it's easy to step away from them. If you're an editor working on somebody else's poetry, or if you're a scholar, it's easy to see somebody else's mistake. It's much harder to see your own mistake. And why is that? We're so attached to what we write, and we're so much into our own heads as we write. It's hard to see where the mistakes are. So this is something to think about. So there's reading for publication is another part of the editing process. And this is my favorite part of the editing process. It's been like this with my doctoral dissertation, and believe me, it was very long. Then it was published as a book, is with my books of essays, and it was the same with my memoir. So 10 books later, I'm here to preach it. Please read your work aloud to yourself. I feel like I'm in a church saying, please read it aloud. It's quite a thing to hear your own voice reading your own work aloud. You find all the mistakes completely without any help from an editor. So before you submit it to anybody. When your poem meets its readers, and the literary, historical, cultural, are the literary, historical, cultural, or even personal allusions doing the work they're supposed to do? That's what you ask when you read your work aloud. Basically, you're going like, am I just talking about what happened in my kitchen? I wonder if people are going to know if this is true self-referential. Or does this sound so good when I read it aloud? Avoid too many personal self-referential allusions. Now, we don't know what happens in the life of a person, in a private life of the person. And this is absolutely part of the creative process, and it's what inspires us to write the poem. But like if we don't have the reference from the fight from last night or last week that was in your living room, we won't know how to follow the poem. So try to sort of, come back to that sort of gently with this. I mean, everything comes from personal experience, but too much self-referential stuff. If I were to now suddenly talk about my background in Romania and how I came to America and just kind of assume that you know my story, you'd be a bit lost and maybe frustrated, right? So if I were to, so it's being gentle with the reader with that. I'll come back to your question. If a literary, cultural, or historical allusion serves the aesthetic and lyrical purpose of your poem, keep it. If not, it's superfluous. It's so tempting to show the reader that we're very well educated, we're very well read, we know so many things, we are encyclopedias, right? Most of us read a lot, know a lot. And it's very tempting to sort of make a reference to say, this is kind of like that, or I see this figure, I see that figure, I see Athena over there, and then I see, Andromeda over there. If it's not absolutely necessary to support the backbone of your poem and the expression of your poem and to give it that, I wouldn't use it. I mean, in classical times, people were saying you could use some of these things almost like decorations, like jewelry, like you put them on a face to give a sense of beauty, to give a sense of sort of elegance. That's pretty much as far as that goes. After that, it's not necessary. However, if it's necessary and you know it, it will be a gift to the reader, so the reader can look up a reference, the reader can learn something new from your poem. So again, it's a balance you'll have to strike. A poem remains an offering to the reader. The most you can ask a reader is in the spirit of, baking a loaf of bread or collecting a bouquet of flowers. Here's something for you. Would you like it? The reader is not obliged to read it, to buy your book, to appreciate it. It really remains an offering. But an offering is such a beautiful thing that we share with each other. So if you hold it as a gift with the hope that it will surprise, that it will delight the reader, even as it challenges the reader to think about difficult things, then it will be very successful for you. So that spirit, I think it's important to think about in editing when you read your poem. Is this an offering? Am I doing this? Or is this poem really trying to beat the reader over the head? You don't see this violence that is happening around. Let me teach you about it. Let me shock you into understanding this. Or let me make you as angry as I am about somebody, because otherwise that's patronizing the reader. That's quite different. Whether you could say, this is what I observed from life. This is how I feel. This is an experience that I had. The reader will come in and say, oh my goodness, I can feel that. Me too. I also had this experience. I can see your point of view. And then finally, I want to go to the copy editing. How do punctuation and grammar reflect the language of the poem? This is basically the cleanup of the poem. Seamus Heaney has a wonderful poem about the death of his mother. In the middle of the poem, he has an ellipsis. He has 3 little dots. You can look at the ellipses as indicating that something was not said. But the way he used them in the poem signaled an insecurity on the side of the father, of his father, when he was talking to his mother saying, and I'll see you next life. So as the poem was constructed, that ellipsis had a completely sort of new meaning to it. It was very surprising. Every time I read that poem, I cry because I'm thinking, oh, he's hesitating. It's not like he's saying some words were not put in a poem that were part of the conversation at the bedside when my mother was dying, is when the father said, and I'll see you in, and the ellipses, you go like, okay, he knows he won't see her again. And you know that whole Catholic, background of the family. It was a moment of doubt, whether is there life after death? And it's just superbly emotional, superbly emotional.
What is the name of that poem?
So the sequence is called Clearances. It's available, it's on the Poetry Foundation website. So you can Google it, it's available to the public for free. You don't need to buy it. So Clearances by Seamus Heaney. So just read the whole thing. It's a bunch of sonnets that he wrote for his parents. If you're playing with syntax and diction, make sure that everything is in the service of meaning. Big words, small words, changing the sentences around, breaking the sentences so they start with dependent clauses. However you play around with that across your lines, and here's where the unit of the line kind of returns to the foreground. Then make sure that everything is used in a service of meaning. People have to get something. They have to understand the poem. And then finally, reading your work aloud. The poem is essentially a container of language that holds the substance of your thoughts, feelings, and reflections on experience. Subject and form must be suited to one another. Now bring the poem into being with your voice. Like a child, it will tell you its own mind. And that's my talk. I am going to take some questions from you because I saw a couple of hands during the slides in here. So, and I think there's a microphone going around so that people who are going to watch this later on YouTube can hear your questions. Yeah.
The phrase was about don't make it too personal, or what was the other part of it?
Self-referential, yeah.
Self-referential, yeah. So, and your example helped, but that is a tough one,
Yeah.
because poetry is the most personal writing there is, I think. And so, I mean, because you're just like showing the world through your eyes. So,
So that's a different filter.
So you want to do that, but of course, if a poem is only about you, well, like, what the heck? Then it doesn't relate to many other people. So that feels like a slippery slope to me.
Yeah, so that is one of the hardest things to decide. And it's not something, at least in my perspective, there is not a decision that I ever make in the process of writing of the poem. So in the process of inspiration and writing that first draft of the poem, I never think about this. It's something, it has to be me, but there is a different filter there, a different perspective there. I aim to show in my poetry my understanding of the world, my experience of the world, my version of the world. And a lot of times when we write the poems, they are in very personal spaces, right? In your room, in your bedroom, in your kitchen, in your mind, it couldn't be more personal or more intimate than that. Okay, so that's something that needs to come out. But it's a process of the mind, ultimately. So if you're not comfortable to share, I mean, there are many people who write about very personal things that they do. Things that they say, if you read it in public, I mean, is it a bit too self-referential? Is it, as I was saying there, if you're referring to a conversation you had with your partner the week before that your reader doesn't know from knowing you, were from another place in the course of the poem, then that becomes more difficult. It's something that needs to be addressed in the process of editing.
So you understand why I'm asking.
I know
this
exactly what
question.
you're asking. I know, because that's,
So,
we all
I mean,
ask.
I like this advice, and I also think it's tricky.
Yeah.
And I'm somebody who is not a fan of narcissism, and it just feels so prevalent in the culture these days. So, and then you're talking about poetry.
So I've been, I won't name things. I review poetry regularly for Harvard Review Online, if you want to look at some of my reviews. I also reviewed for poetry, PN Review in England. So that would give you like a sense of the critical part of it. But to give you an example of a poem that I thought wasn't so successful by somebody, and I won't name the person because there's no point in doing that. There's somebody who is saying, well, I went to this tower in, I think in Seattle, and I was sky high on cocaine, and then goes on to the rest of the poem. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's very nice, except I don't really get how that relates to what you're saying later in the poem, and that seems to me very self-referential. I wouldn't understand your frame of mind when you're on cocaine. But what I'm very interested is in what do you say about what you see down below when you're looking at the landscape? Do you see what I mean? No judgment on what he was doing. But then again, it seemed to me too self-referential for me. It wasn't something for me to work with. I would like, as a reader, I have certain, and every reader is the same, right? Every reader is different.
It's a dance between sharing your view on the world and your perspective, and also inviting somebody else to understand and want them to have understanding about what.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, we all write about ourselves. What we want to do is to sort of the reader to be side by side with us, looking at the world, right? So if I can write a poem, for example, about my parents' divorce. My parents were forced to divorce in Romania because my father was a political dissident, right? So I couldn't really give you the poem without explaining a little bit about it. Right, so that's something, but my intention with the poem that is called The Divorce is to bring you side by side with me and for you to look. The ultimate question that happened to me then, and it happened to me 30 years later, and I would hope that would happen to the reader, is how is it possible for a government to control the private life of the family? How is it just really using my personal experience, my very personal experience, as a way of asking larger questions about humanity and about the larger human experience. But I had to negotiate the very thing you're talking about. And the very thing I'm talking about. So I think here is where we're converging, right? When it's like, do you really care about why my parents divorced? I mean, how is that any part of your world? I mean, as a reader. Maybe you just want to read a book of poems, you know, about something else. So, but I'm hoping to make you care, even if it was my personal experience. That's the idea. It's an offering. It's not a read it, this is important, this is political, you got to read it, or else you're missing something, right? It's not. It's an invitation. Would you like to do it? But I had to negotiate on how I told that story. How did I introduce that information? So I tell you, I've gone through many, many drafts of that poem. In the early drafts, I had to tell I felt like I had to tell the whole story of Romania and of communism just to get to the poem. It took me many years to get back to a point where I felt confident enough to say, and we were in a courtroom. And our breaths were white, rising with the cold, outside the walls of the courtroom. And then my father was in chain. And so I was able to create that scene where you would get it without knowing all of the personal details, that there was no way you could get them if I didn't write like a massive footnote in there. So this is what I'm going in here. So not to discourage. That's the only way we know anything. Was it Leonardo da Vinci who says, you know, the experience is the mother of everything, of the mother of knowledge. You can't vouch for anything unless you touch, you feel, and you know. So as somebody who creates language, as somebody who creates art, you have to count on your experience. Is the only way to say, well, but I know this. I know what a hand is like because I'm touching your hand, right? I know what pain is like because I suffered pain. I know what happiness is because I looked onto the faces that express that happiness, and this is how the muscles move, and this is how this is. So that's what I mean with that. It's a fabulous question for like an MFA program, right? To just go on this, especially in the American culture, where almost everything is confessional poetry, and almost everything is, you know, as opposed to the European culture that is a bit more, this is what I observe, and I'm slightly more removed, and it's about other people, and it's about other things. So it's the temperament of the cultures as well. Any other questions? Yes, please. There's a microphone coming.
Is it on?
Yeah.
You said starting with dependent clauses, but what I missed was don't start or do start?
No, you can.
Okay.
You can start, yes, of course, yeah. Okay. It's however you do it, I said. However you do it, whether you start with dependent clause, whether you start with the independent clause, however you structure your sentence, however you move your syntax, and also however you choose your words, whichever words you choose, right? However you play with the diction. It has to be in a service of making sense for the reader.
Okay.
In the structure of the poem, yeah. So there are no rules there. I haven't seen the rules in there.
Thank you for today. When you have like a collection of poems and you're trying to get them together, does it make a difference if like one poem uses like punctuation and then the second poem like on a different page doesn't use punctuation? Like is there is that kind of frowned upon if you're putting a collection together and wanting to submit it for something? Like do editors look at like each individual poem and then the collection as a whole is how like they're presented on the page? Like, is that something that needs to be consistent in a collection, or is it okay to like have varied styles, I guess?
So I had these conversations a lot of times with the editors. And mostly it's because we're talking about, when I was working on my own collections, we were talking about the formal versus informal style. Do I want to have capitalizations of every word at the beginning of every line, or do I want to follow the sentence structure and do it like this? And And so, I mean, you will run into collections that have a very specific style in terms of punctuation, either no punctuation at all, where they would have, there's the poet's voice, the poet's style. You recognize them by the way they do their writing. I mean, think about W.S. Merwin and his sort of translations of haikus. But I have two thoughts about this, based on the one hand, I think each poem is its own unit of thought. The thing that is a clear mistake is if you have, and I see this in workshops all the time, people start with proper punctuation, the first stanza, and then by the end of the poem, there's no full stop at the end of the poem. And I find myself, well, why is there no, oh, well, I just forgot about it. Where it was just, I just didn't. So that's where the editing comes into, like paying attention to that. As long as you're consistent within a poem, my first thought, it doesn't matter because every poem is its own unique being. Maybe the theme is about world events or personal expressions of, whatever different kinds of feelings or, meditation on time. You can organize it different. So at that point, your reader isn't going to really focus so much on your punctuation. But there is the other thought, which is, why do I have a poem that is like this, and why do I have a poem that is like that? So some people might, maybe you can group those into sections. Here are poems that, I can have a series. I start the book with 6 triolets, and then I move on to 6, free verse, and then with these ones, 6 haikus, and there's no punctuation there. You can also do it like this. The important thing is for the collection to kind of be harmonious. So it doesn't really matter if your drive is emotion or thought, and you have the reader sort of strong on following a sort of a narrative of this. But it becomes more important when you write about everything. And you have a collection together, so then you kind of say, well, I have a little sequence like this and a little sequence like that. So that can make sense, yeah. The epigraphs really help. I've been using this in some collections of mine where I would say it's chronological, but there is also an epigraph that kind of groups the poems into a specific thought. And then, I've been using sort of translating little bits of Dante. So I've been putting the one line and then a set of poems and then another line and a set of poems. And if you read just the epigraphs, you kind of get the narrative drive of the book, but I don't have the poems functioning as prose or as stories or as anything like that. I'm not expecting the reader to sort of make up a full story, and I didn't put that expectation on myself to write a full story with everything in it. So that's another way of sort of adding texture and structure to your book. Yeah.
I have a question about the length of the poems. When I write a first draft of a poem, it's usually extremely short, like 4 lines or something. And then I struggle when I go back to edit. Should I try to expand it into something longer and more like thorough, detailed? Or should I leave it as this short, very short, like message? So do you have any advice about this?
I do. I sure do, yeah. So it really depends on the poem and what you, so some people just put these very packed poems, almost, well, every line is really a thread that you can unspool. You just unravel and then you can turn it into a story. So it depends on what you say in those lines. So you could just look at those lines as an outline for a poem. and you say, I'm going to have a stanza about this and a stanza about that and a stanza about that, if you want to expand it. The question to ask yourself is, and I'm talking now the same way I talk around the house, is like you feel it within yourself, is all instinctual. Have I said what I wanted to say with this? Do I feel like this is out in exactly the words I wanted to have? That's the fight that you have in this editing process. I don't need to do it. I was taught at University of Michigan, of all places, doing a creative writing major of all things, that everything has to work towards condensing the language. The images manifesto, pounds, images manifesto, all of these things is like make it short, make that image, make that sound. Yes. However, how about expanding some of that until I think that I have a full story here? So there are also the narrative poems that allow you to develop, long thoughts, that allow you to sort of create these beautiful scenes where your reader can come and stand side by side and look at the world with you, right? So there isn't really an advice other than what's inside you. That instinct of yours is like, yeah, sure, I have a 4-line poem. Have I said what I want, or have I only hinted? Does it read more like a riddle, and then I can pick at it? Just pick, and then the threads come out, and then I have this beautiful poem coming out. Or is it really sufficient? I gave the reader enough that they can have this strong image in their, mind's eye, and then they can go and think about that. I mean, think about these haikus, for example. They can be so, so powerful, so beautiful. All done? All right, thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thank you. Join me in thanking you.